I'm your host, Dr. Tim Scheel. I'm the director of the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation. I'll be your host for our event this afternoon. I just have a few brief remarks, and then we'll turn things over to our featured speaker. So tonight's event on free speech dilemmas in social media are my center, MCSII, and the Institute for Humane Studies. MCSII is a network of 23 public and private universities and colleges in Wisconsin. Our mission is to promote the study and discussion of civil liberties and their relationships to institution and innovation. We fund speakers and panels and faculty and student research, student internships, and a lot more across the state. You can find out more about us at our website, www.uwstout.edu/CSII. We're partnering today with the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. IHS supports and partners with professors and students to promote teaching and research of classical liberal ideas and to advance higher education's core purpose of intellectual discovery and diversity, open inquiry, and human progress. You can find out more about IHS at their website, theihs.org. Our featured speaker this afternoon is Kate Klonick. She is an assistant professor at St. John's University Law School in New York City and an affiliate fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. Her research on networked technologies' effect on social norm enforcement, freedom of expression, and private governance has appeared in many publications, including the Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, the New Yorker, New York Times, the Atlantic, the Guardian, a very impressive list of publications. I would invite you to submit questions in the Zoom Q&A function throughout the talk, and we'll get to those at the conclusion of Professor Klonick's opening remarks. So without further ado, I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me. This is a topic that I have been researching now for an extended period of time, longer than I almost like to admit. I think it's about 3 years, and it has been incredibly controversial and has grown into an incredible amount of controversy that we kind of saw coming, but I think many didn't. And so basically my talk today is going to go over my experience as a researcher and a law professor studying the build out of the oversight board, the Facebook oversight board, and kind of how to open it up for how to think about the oversight board, especially as it comes into making the decision in the coming weeks around Donald Trump's suspension from the platform. So just a little bit about kind of my work. Generally, I work specifically doing descriptive ethnographic like empirical qualitative work that kind of goes through and looks at tech companies instead of theorizing about what they're doing and tries to actually go into the companies and work with them to describe with interviews with former employees and people that are associated with the platforms or have been associated with the platforms in the past, put together basically what it is the platforms are doing to govern the rights of their users. And so I started this work in 2015 with Facebook in particular, but Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Basically, at that point, there was a series of content moderation was not on the front page of every major publication at the time. It was something that was kind of in the weeds and people weren't talking about. And the general kind of, honestly, when I started in 2015, which was just 6 years ago, I would start every talk with describing what content moderation was, which is kind of the idea that private platforms remove certain types of speech that their third-party users post as part of how they curate their platform. And one of the reason I mention this, and then I'm kind of going down memory lane for a second, is because it's actually really important ultimately in reminding ourselves how quickly this has changed and how fast the world has had to suddenly adjust to these new realities. So in 2018, I published a paper in the Harvard Law Review called The New Governors that went through basically the rules, processes, and people that were in place at all of these private companies to govern public rights like freedom of expression. And I went through and kind of, in particular with Facebook, discussed how they had put a process in place in which content was flagged by other users, sent for review to like an army basically of content moderators all over the world. To review content, determine whether it was violative of Facebook's community standards or not. And at that point, when I started that research, they had what was, for people who were in the industry, kind of referred to the private rules and the public rules. They had a very vague set of out-facing public rules, community standards for their users, and then they had like a 90-page internal Wikipedia document that was private and nobody had seen, except a few content moderators that was the everyday tool that they were running, that was updated, and they were running their kind of content moderation practices on. So fast forward to April 2018. Mark Zuckerberg testifies in Congress with Cambridge Analytica, and the same month he gives a interview to Ezra Klein saying that you can imagine something like a Supreme Court that might be a better way of making these content moderation decisions than what we're doing now. Shortly thereafter, the policy team at Facebook decides that they're going to consolidate the 90-page private Wikipedia, or non-public Wikipedia kind of rules into the community standards. That's the rules that we have today. Those become public. We still really have no way of knowing whether there's not another shadow document behind that. We can get into that later. But in November 2018, about 6 months later, Zuckerberg announced that they were in fact going to create a Supreme Court. So this is November 2018, and he announces that they're going to create the Oversight Board. That was a working name at the beginning. It became less of a working name as it went on. No one could come up with anything better. They did hate, when I say they, refers to Facebook. Facebook hated kind of having this, when people called it a Supreme Court, but it's the best analogy people could come up with, so that's where we kind of landed. But announced that they would be creating the Oversight Board over the next year. And so starting in January of 2019, Nick Clegg, who was the director of communications and still is, began a process that they called the global consultancy process. And they started a team internal at Facebook that was called the Governance and Strategic Initiatives Team. The Governance and Strategic Initiatives Team, which is basically in charge, was underneath, the head of that was underneath Nick Clegg, and then there was Mark Zuckerberg. In the kind of the backside of Facebook corporate structure, this is a very, very, what they would call unlayered set of kind of chain of command, meaning that the project, signaling to others that the project was very important to Zuckerberg himself. So Nick Clegg is charged with kind of driving this global, the Governance Strategic Initiatives team. They decided to kind of split this into like 3 phases. And the first phase for the first 6 months is a global consultancy project, which is basically going all over the world to different stakeholders and asking them what they think something like an oversight board should be. It ended up serving about 3,000 people. There were 6 major workshops, events that were about 50 to 60 people each, in which people kind of gave ideas to the company. They consolidated all of this in June of 2019 into a global report that kind of said what people had wanted out of the oversight board. And then they started making the hard choices of how to write up the founding documents that would basically take the board from an idea into existence. I just want to pause for 1 second and kind of write myself into kind of the narrative of this and like where I was in this process and my role, because I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge it. So in May of 2019, I received a number of grants from the Charles Koch Initiative, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Knight Foundation to basically go if, with Facebook's permission, I had to ask permission, obviously, to be a rapporteur for this process of building this out. And so Facebook gave me embedded access with no NDA, and I was allowed to tape all of my interviews every time that I was at the company. So this began a project of about 1 week out of every month. I would go to Menlo Park and spend time meeting and interviews with like the same group of individuals over and over again, and kind of check in on the progress of the various projects. And in between there, I would have calls with them and talk to outside stakeholders and be doing other things. But all of this was kind of the payoff of this project was in a piece that I wrote for the Yale Law Journal, on the Facebook Oversight Board, that documented descriptively this process and kind of places it in terms of how to think of it in terms of governance, legitimacy, independence, and judicial review, and also a conversation. And also I pitched and was accepted to write a piece for the New Yorker. So I wrote about a 7,000 word piece for the New Yorker that came out in February of this year. Just if you want to read anything else about this. So that began in May of 2019. I went to 2 of the workshops, the one in New York and Berlin, and then started going to my weekly visits or my monthly visits to Facebook, to Menlo Park. And I describe the period from July until probably November as one of kind of great discomfort for the team. And it was a period of a lot of hard choices. It's a period of a lot of people talking kind of in a high-minded way about what they were creating. And there was a lot of idealism. There was not a lot of precedent for what they were creating, this public-private thing, the divestment of power, how to give it actual power and imbue it with actual kind of gravitas, and how to help it build legitimacy, how to make it actually independent. So one of the things that people said over and over again in the global consultancy phase was effectively that they wanted this to be true. If they wanted this to be a real thing, it had to be truly independent from Facebook. And they meant intellectually, they meant in terms of the board members would have to be intellectually independent, they would have to be financially independent, all of these things. So there had to figure out kind of solve the chicken and the egg problem of how are you going to create a third-party oversight board that is truly independent and has watchdog kind of oversight over the thing that is funding it, right? How are you going to kind of do that? And so over the next kind of 3 or 4 months, a number of documents were drafted. The first was the charter, which is not a charter in a traditional business law sense. It is actually a charter in kind of a just kind of an open kind of contract and commitment sense. And it gives the broad kind of overview of what the board is going to do, how it's going to be formed, and of the trust that is going to manage the money that is going to be created and manage the board. And it is kind of a very high level document and not overly long. And then many months later, that document and a lot more meat was put on the bones of kind of this, of that shell, by the bylaws. A lot more restrictions and lists of restrictions on what things were in scope and what were out of scope, what was going to be part of the board's purview and what wasn't, how Facebook would respond and how it wouldn't, and how Facebook could refer cases to the board, or how the board could refuse to take on cases from Facebook. So all of that is sorted out in those initial documents and a trust and LLC documents that happen in the fall of 2019. The bylaws come out in January of 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic hits. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, behind kind of all of this structural constitutionalism, as I kind of think of it, or like kind of the writing of the documents, there's an old adage that like every institution is 20% the documents and 80% the people. Of course, they had to be picking the people who were going to be on the board. And of course, it was incredibly problematic that Facebook pick the people who are going to be basically overturning their decisions. And so what they settled on as a means of picking members and selecting members was they picked 4 co-chairs. And the co-chairs would then work with Facebook and the governance and strategic initiative to uh, to go and pick the remaining members and determine what it would mean to have a globally diverse body in this sense. And so that was in fact what had happened. I was not super privy to the member selection process, mostly because people were making up their minds up until the last moment whether or not they wanted to do this, and Facebook was obligated to protect their privacy, and in basically in determining whether or not, like, there were a number of people who didn't want it to become public that they were being considered for this until they had finally decided that they were going to do it. So the pandemic hits in February, March of 2020. Um, and this is like kind of obviously this is they're just getting started, and this is kind of a huge delay. But nevertheless, in early May, they announce all of the members for the board, or at least the first 20. So there's actually, imagine the board will have 40 members in total, and the global body of people. But for the beginning, it was necessary to just start the board going and hearing cases before they had like the entire they had the entire full board in place. So May of 2020, the board slate is announced, and it is an incredibly illustrious, pretty serious group of individuals, all of whom are basically being asked to stake their global reputation on this project, which I mention here now because I think it's significant for kind of, I'm sure, some comments that people are going to say later. These include a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, a former circuit judge from the US, a number of US law professors, a number of law professors from all over the world, human rights activists, international human rights lawyers, the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. It is just it is a very impressive list of people, and it is pretty diverse. There were five Americans. One has resigned, Pamela Karlan, who is a Stanford law professor. And she has resigned from the board, I think because I can't remember if she was in the transition team or went into the Biden administration, but she resigned in any event from the board. And there was significant controversy whether five Americans, given the fact that only 7% of Facebook's user base is based in the US, whether 5 out of 20 Americans was too many, or too few, because it was an American company. And so that was a significant, I was expecting that to be more of a point of contention, and it was less of one when it was kind of all said and done. The board launched, and so they announced their members in May of 2020, but importantly, they did not start taking cases. They decided, and fascinatingly, as a researcher, I had to now negotiate, because they were independent from Facebook, I now had to negotiate a separate agreement for kind of visibility with the oversight board. Not that was separate from Facebook, because now all of a sudden all of my access with Facebook was like not transferable to the oversight board. And so I did that, and I began kind of covering both, talking to the old team at Facebook who was finishing up the project and moving on, and then the new oversight board team, and kind of seeing how they were setting things up and how they started to set up over the pandemic year and over 2020, leading up to the election, the US election in November, was that they basically started to run demo panels. So they would have it's imagined that there will be a 5-person panel for any like one case. And so they started to run demo panels where they would take an example, they would work together as a group, and they would write a draft decision. And so they were doing this, and they were also having kind of, and not to sound corny, but like kind of trust fall exercises over Zoom. Like they were getting to know each other, trying to kind of like create some coherency and institutional kind of trust within the group themselves, because it was all a bunch of people who'd never met each other. The one thing I would say from sitting in some of these meetings is that because of time zones, there were very few, like all of them being on a call at once. A lot of it was done piecemeal. And so that is like one very like infrastructurally, I think, significant constraint, is that like there are certain types of things that like some panels are just never going to necessarily sit together because it's just going to be completely like unfeasible for them to like have a meeting because like of how difficult it will be to like schedule their time together. Um, but all of these panels, all of this kind of practice led up to in the fall, the oversight board announcing they were opening the portal on Facebook to allow user appeals to be made directly to the oversight board, and then they were going to start selecting them, and then they were going to start selecting them, and then they would make a decision on them and issue opinions in January. Obviously, January 6th happened, 2021. And this was, we had, just to kind of put it in context across the platforms and everything that was happening in the 2 days following January 6th and on January 6th itself, Twitter at first took down a number of Donald Trump tweets. Then they banned Donald Trump. And then Facebook took down a number of posts, and then they banned Donald Trump. And then I think the order of events was that Twitter then said that the ban was permanent, and Facebook said theirs was indefinite. Just because I'm a lawyer and language matters, this is this was the terminology. Pretty much immediately, people started, and maybe I was specifically acute to it because obviously this has been like my life for the last 2 years, but there was instantly kind of well, why is Facebook banning this world leader? You had Angela Merkel. Like say that this was a problematic. Navalny in Russia like had, was like, this is a terrible precedent to set. The Mexican and French governments both said, both protested. There was kind of concern generally from people in the free speech world, even those that greatly disliked Donald Trump and disliked Facebook, thought that this was a very problematic precedent to set. How do you decide which leaders? How do you let a private company silence a world leader who is democratically elected, even if everything that they're doing like meets some type of dangerous speech standard or universal kind of standard for collective harm? It was just a tremendous lesson, I think, for the world in how much power these private companies have. And I think that there was kind of also a moment of like, well, and no one country could stop them. It wasn't even clear that the entire EU could stop Facebook or break up Facebook or anything else. And it's been that way for a while, but I think that this was kind of a moment of people seeing that the end game was incredibly limited. So the next question I think a lot of people said who were aware of the oversight board was, well, why isn't the oversight board taking this case? And it was very clear that the oversight board was going to take the case to me, and then and then that was confirmed by Facebook shortly thereafter, generally with the idea that it's going to wait until January, that they were going to wait until after until Biden's inauguration to let it happen, which is in fact what happened. They referred it on January 21st. The case is they had 90 days. The oversight board then convened a random panel to examine the case and the file that Facebook sent regarding the indefinite whether Donald Trump, the narrow question that was asked was whether Donald Trump should continue to have an indefinite suspension on Facebook. And if you want to tell us how to deal with world leaders going forward, that would be great. And their opinion will come out 90 days from the day it was referred, which is 8 days from now, April 21st. And it will make a recommendation to Facebook that Facebook does not necessarily have to follow. But that will be one of the major questions that kind of gets pulled into the fray. Is I have a list of like the top 3 questions that I think are going to be coming out of April 21st, but we can get there in a second. Quickly, because I'm aware that I've been talking for a long time without kind of putting kind of a visual kind of context on what I'm talking about and how this all works. This is my own visualization of kind of how the three bodies that Facebook created in order to create the oversight board. So you have Facebook here. They created a trust in October of 2019. The trust is a Delaware trust. And the next day they created the Oversight Board LLC. So the Oversight Board actually officially sits in an LLC. And the trust, the entire purpose of the trust is to serve the needs of the LLC. Okay, so this is how basically the trust has control over. This is the bubble that was created to give Facebook the Oversight Board financial independence from Facebook. So then, just like, how does this all work? Where do the trustees come from, and then how, like, what do they control? Well, of course, like, trustees control the purse strings of the trust. And so where did the money come from? The money is an endowment is actually, this graphic is a little old. I changed the language of it because it's not it's not an endowment. It is a $130 million gift. $130 million is simply not enough to create an endowment. And also the trust documents restrict the trustees' abilities to invest and control their own, the money. The money is still like the management of the money in terms of investment, because it's not liquid, is still controlled by Facebook. But the $130 million is a commitment that they have made to the trust that they cannot revoke as a gift. There was one corporate trustee that was appointed, and now there are 5. They have appointed all 5 trustees. And the trustees, as you can kind of see here, this is how they all interact. And I just want to like point out, because I think it's very important when you talk about independence to understand who controls who names who, and who like has power to remove whoever else. Hiring and firing is like a huge part of independence, as we know from like constitutional law, and life. And so you can see here that Facebook picks the trustees, and Facebook makes this irrevocable gift. And then you have the trustees that formally approve the firing or hiring. They like release the funds to the oversight board, but all of their work has to come at the direct recommendation of the board itself. So let's talk about the board. As I said before, the board is an LLC. Technically, the board is just this lower half. Well, not the board, but the LLC is just this lower half. It is the staff side. Think of it as like the clerk of the court or staff attorneys. Now it is up to about 50 people. It started out with just one director that was Thomas Hughes, who is running the whole organization, setting the yearly budget. It's basically like running a startup, to be perfectly a nonprofit startup in a sense, is how you could think of what he was doing. And so they basically are there to support the actual board itself, which is the 20 people that I mentioned. I have the hiring committee here because the hiring committee is a 5-person panel from the board that is, in fact, the people who make the hires and the removal to determine the board itself. You will note that there is nothing about how cases are come in and out of this. This isn't just an institutional structure graphic. So let's take a second and I will pull up what does this actually mean for the everyday Facebook user, and Facebook's power, and the real meat and potatoes of how they can enforce this. Okay. So this is again, you start in the bottom left corner here. When we're talking about the scope and jurisdiction of the type of material that the board can review, they just announced today, actually, that they have expanded the scope. But I'll just talk about for a second what the scope was at outset until today. It was only content that had been removed by Facebook, that was single object content, which is defined as a photo, a video, or a piece of text. And so you would have, as a user, you would have your removed user post. You would appeal it internally with Facebook's own mechanism of content moderation appeal. And if it came down again or stayed down, You would then have the option to appeal it to the oversight board. To appeal it to the oversight, functionally, they give you a unique file ID that gets generated. And then you have to, there's no like direct button, you have to copy and paste and take your file ID over to the external independent oversight board website and enter it there. At that point, Facebook will clean up all of the PII, the personal identifiable information, and transfer your file to the oversight board. The oversight board kind of compiles and organizes all of the cases come in. It's about 1 million, so far about 1 million appeals in any one cycle. So about 10,000 every few days, cases that are being appealed to the board. There's a case selection committee that is a random case selection committee of 5 members that chooses which cases they think are the most important. So you will note already that this is much more like a writ kind of process in the Supreme Court than it is like any type of direct appeal process that you would have at the trial court or an appellate division or kind of the myriad of apex courts that we have in the United States. Once the case selection committee chooses which cases, and in the first batch, there were about 6 cases, 4 of which were appealed by users and 2 of which came from Facebook. And we'll talk about the Facebook ability to appeal things in a second. But those cases go to a 5-person anonymous panel. And we can talk about also why it's anonymous. And there's some very big safety reasons there for the nature of the work that's being done. But a 5-person anonymous panel who iteratively deliberates through email and messages and kind of like starting a draft opinion to create something that is to create like a draft opinion. Nobody knew, and it is not specified, how a lot of some of the details of this process would work. In fact, it was contemplated, should we put in that the decisions have to be 10 pages long? Should we put in that there should be dissents? Should we not put in that there should be dissents? Should we say that they're per curiam? Should we let them decide if they identify themselves? And when I'm saying we, I'm talking about Facebook as they're drafting kind of the charter and the bylaws. Should we put all of these details into the founding documents, or should we let the board have the independence to choose these things themselves? And ultimately, the board has decided that they are going to have kind of a blend notice and comment amici period where they allow outside parties to submit notice and comments and like basically small 3-page briefs on every case that they'll consider. That they're going to do some fact finding and record finding using outside bodies. They have asked for reports from UNESCO in some cases and from hate speech experts in other cases. They have decided they're going to stay anonymous, that there will not be dissents, that it will be just one opinion, and that any type of dissent will be kind of built into the decision by counter argument. And the decisions are about 10 pages long so far. So they give a decision, and there's 2 parts of the decision: what actually happens to the content, whether it gets restored by Facebook or it stays down, and then of course policy recommendations that might flow from that decision. The majority of the board, like 11 people, have to approve of the decision, and if they don't and it gets voted down, it goes and convenes a new panel. But let's say that it does get approved. The decision is approved and published, and it's sent to Facebook for enforcement. Facebook then has 2 weeks to basically respond to all of the policy recommendations publicly and how they did or did not implement them and why or why not they did not implement them. And also the one area of the one tiny sliver of actual teeth is that Facebook has to, as to that one particular piece of content, put that piece of content back up if that's what the oversight board tells them to do. They are not obligated to do similar or identical pieces of identical pieces of content. It is only that one. So this is the only really real absolute promise that Facebook has made to how this all works. So that is the user mechanism for appeal. And the Facebook mechanism for appeal is threefold. Facebook this is probably the least likely to be used, but to use an expedited, to refer something to the board as expedited review, which is Facebook means that the oversight board has to take it and listen to and hear the case. And Facebook binds itself to the full decision, policy, and content specific of whatever the oversight board does. And because I think that's a huge risk, I don't think that Facebook's going to do that very often. Two, Facebook can take a case that is from an individual user that they think is a really good example of a problem they see very often, and they can refer that individual case to the board for its consideration. The board does not have to take that case, and it does. And if it does take that case, Facebook does not have to adhere to its decision. And then the final thing is for a general, like basically policy recommendation and review. In which case the board can hear it or cannot, and then Facebook can also decide not to listen to the board or to listen to the board. And that's the category that we're in for the Donald Trump case. So I have said a lot very, very, very quickly. And I am aware that it is 4:36, and I think this is going to be about 40 minutes long. And so I think I've come in right on time. So I'm thrilled to take any questions and dig into all of these ideas and hear people's thoughts on what is going to happen next and what they are concerned about or what they are excited about.